My name is James Banks, and I'm the Killinger Professor of Education at the University of Washington, Emeritus, and a past president of AERA. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the session which highlights the research of the winner of the 2023 AERA Early Career Award, who is Dr. Dominique Baker. She was the recipient of the 2003 Early Career Award, and I was fortunate enough to be able to chair the committee that gave her that award, and it was a horse race. There were so many excellent people, but AERA only allows you to select one, so it's always a very difficult decision, and of course, we're delighted with our choice and our decision. Dr. Dominique Baker is Associate Professor of Education and Public Policy with a joint appointment in the College of Education and Human Development and the Joseph R. Biden School of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Delaware. She is also a John and Patrick Cochrane Scholar of Inclusive Education, which is an endowed faculty position that recognizes outstanding University of Delaware faculty members whose scholarship and service reflect excellence, creativity, and a commitment to inclusiveness, both on campus and beyond. Dr. Baker's research focused on the ways that educational policy affects and shapes the access and success of minoritized students in higher education. She has testified on the interaction between race, racism, and student loans before the U.S. Senate. Her work and expertise have been highlighted by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and NPR. She earned her PhD from Vanderbilt University and her master's and bachelor's degrees from the University of Virginia, Mr. Jefferson's University. It is with pleasure that I introduce Professor Dominique Baker. Let's warmly welcome her to the podium.
Okay, thank y'all so much for coming. Okay, so we are going to talk today about my career, which is a very odd thing to prepare a talk for. I would like to let you know if you have never done this before. So I'm going to say thank you for you all going on a journey with me as we sort of travail that. Oh, yeah, okay. So this is the disclaimer just to start. A lot of people, some in this room, thank you, funded some of the work that I'm going to talk about today. The basics are everything I say today, that's on me. So if you get upset about anything, don't bother those people, bother me. Thank you. Okay, so when I first heard about this talk, I really just wanted it to be like an hour of me thanking people because there is nothing that I do without the support and care from my community. But it seemed that that was not exactly what AERA wanted, so I figured I would just trim it down a little bit. And so what I would do is at least look somewhere else where I had thanked people previously, which is my dissertation. And I noticed that the dedication of my dissertation actually says, to my saintly mother and father for never letting me forget the awesome power and responsibility education brings. And to my amazing nieces and nephews, I do this work for you so that there never need to be another dream deferred. And I really like that because I also think that that is the dedication of my career. I would add, so that was written in a time of my life before I also met my lovely husband. So I would add in that this is also to Chris, who, trust me, even if you don't know my husband, if I have work done, it's because this man helps make sure that like I'm alive and that I haven't like lost my job yet. So I will truncate my thank yous here, but sincerely, I truly appreciate all of the time and energy that people have given me, even when they didn't know that they were doing it. Okay, so what do you sort of put into a talk like this? I've already figured out that it's probably not just me doing a scroll of credits where I say thank you to everyone. And so as I was thinking about this, I actually started ruminating last week. For those that know me, my parents have spent all of my life really trying to impress upon me the power and legacy of the Black struggle for liberation. And especially given that my dad's side of the family is from Memphis, Tennessee, last week, as I was thinking about Martin Luther King Jr., one of the things that I thought a lot about was the fact that my parents always told me that it wasn't enough to think about that Martin Luther King died in the service of sort of these larger, broad ideals, but to also think about the micro and why he was in Memphis. And that was on behalf of sanitation workers. And so that is a thing that, in my family, that is a thing you know. And so as I thought about that, it led me to thinking a bit about purpose. And so I was thinking about his speech the night before he was assassinated, where he said, well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. I take very seriously the notion that when it comes to thinking about social justice, racial justice, that I do work that I may never see the full fruits of. I don't do this work with the notion that, as much as I would like for it to be, that we will see that promised land in my lifetime. So that means that I have to commit to doing small pieces here and there, and that has to be a part of my purpose. So I figured I would show some pieces from some strands of my work to think about that. This will not be, so sorry if you wanted a lit review of my work, that's just not going to happen. But I'll do some hints to it. So we can think about sort of debt, student loan debt, and admissions with this. I did an interview after 2 different Supreme Court cases last year where the Biden-Harris plan for canceling student loan debt and race-conscious admissions were severely curtailed or just overturned. And with the Associated Press, one of the things I said was, these are policy tools that have an explicit aim around reducing the power of white supremacy, Baker said. That's me. The 2 court challenges, she said, can be seen, quote, as linked backlash to 2 attempts towards racial justice. And now that's not just my musing ideas, right? I've done a lot of work that sort of thinks about this, starting from the point where I was focused on the impact of borrowing among community college students, which is a group that we don't often think about with student loans, but actually is a very real concern, that then spread into thinking about what does it mean for different people to struggle to repay their student loans? How do we think about how much people have borrowed in ratio to how much they earn? What does that mean and look like? And in particular, thinking about the experiences of students at HBCUs. What does that mean? What is that experience like? And even recently, I've been doing some work with my favorite co-author, my husband, and some fabulous graduate students, thinking about how we talk about student loans in the media, especially the race-evasive way that we talk about student loans in the media. So I've been trying to explore and think about who does education policy work for and who does it not serve? What are the ways that we might make it serve someone differently? This is actually some of the work that, as I'll talk about a little bit later, led to the Biden-Harris debt cancellation plan. But I also did work in admissions, right? So I'm not shooting from the hip there either. I'm actually a former admissions professional. And beyond that, I have looked at what was the political context within states before they adopted bans on race-conscious admissions. I looked at how we could potentially find solutions within admissions, because so often, right, we just do research where we say everything is terrible. And so I was like, oh, I could work with a really awesome colleague and we could try to see if this was something that was a solution. Spoiler alert, it's not. So, it's keeping the thread going strong. But also looking at trying to understand how we incentivize who gets to enroll at different community colleges, especially based on the funding structure, where we see that well-funded community colleges often get whiter student bodies. And thinking about things like hate crimes and Black college student enrollment and what it might mean when a larger macro social environment is hateful towards a group of people. How do they try to make the best choices they can for what belongingness and inclusion can look like within higher education? So these are strands of research that I have spent a fair amount of time on that have really pushed me to think a lot and to try to think carefully about how we think about justice and the role that public policy related to education can occur. And I love research, right? But I also love getting to talk to other people. Those who know me know it's getting me to stop talking. That's the interesting challenge. I have tried to do things like at the beginning of the pandemic, writing pieces on how we have to think about immediate shifts in our financial aid system to be responsive to COVID-19. Very recently, last week, putting together a piece for Brookings to focus on what long-term and lasting college affordability looks like. But I've also, as Dr. Banks mentioned, testified before the United States Senate, the Subcommittee on Economics, which is always wild to me because I'm not an economist, but I am a person that is frequently confused for an economist. So that was always a lovely little full circle piece there. I have helped co-author amicus briefs for the Supreme Court. In this instance, this was for the Biden-Harris debt cancellation plan. And I actually, just a couple of weeks ago, spent my spring break in part at the White House to talk about more recent student loan payment plans. And in each one of these pieces, my overriding goal has been to try to think carefully about what our research evidence says is a pathway towards racial justice. And that can be challenging, especially when you only have 30 seconds. But I think it's incredibly important because ultimately, when we think about student loans, we think about my research in conversation with other people's research, what we come to are that loans are culture. And this is actually a thing that I got a chance to talk about with a friend, Anne Helen Peterson, on her podcast, Culture Study. But basically, that student loan debt is fundamentally intertwined with our larger society. It shows us what we value, who we think is deserving, and who is allowed abundance in our society. And I think all of my work put together, those are the salient pieces to me, that when we make decisions about our college affordability policies, we're answering who we think matters. Similarly, you're shocked, I think admissions is also culture. How students gain access to colleges and universities and which institutions we think are worthy of having their admissions studied is fundamentally intertwined with our larger society. This is actually something I was just discussing on Vox's Today Explained as I was having the fun job of talking about what it means when institutions bring back test scores at for part of their admissions process. But I would say that admissions shows us what we value, who is legible as smart, which matters because I think that I am no more or less intelligent than my grandmothers before me. Yet, some would have said, right, that for them to earn a PhD would be astounding, right? So what does it mean that we think about who is legible as smart versus who has these innate pieces of intelligence, potentially, if we believe there are innate pieces of intelligence? And also which institutions are worthy of our time, attention, and funding matters severely. Because whenever we talk about admissions, we sort of create a world where there's about 20 institutions that matter in these United States. And all the students that attend all of the other institutions sort of float by the wayside. And that's something that's just really striking to me. And it's one of the things that when I talk and think and do research on race-conscious admissions, I am still thinking really carefully about which institutions I'm talking about and how these policies shift as I think about the larger ecosystem of higher education. So in summation, we can sort of think from a purpose-defined perspective. When I started these strands of work, the world was a bit different, right? So we could say that race-conscious admissions had broader use. I wouldn't say that race-conscious admissions is currently banned. I would say that it is heavily curtailed. If it was completely banned, you wouldn't be allowed to talk about your race at all. And that race-evasive discussions of student loans were really prevalent, both in the public and in policy sectors. But I return to this notion that even if I may not get the chance to see the fruits of my labors, I will conduct research that matters and communicate with publics and fight within communities dedicated to a just world. So I see my work as a part of a larger body of work from researchers, activists, coming together to try to think about what we can imagine a different world to look like. So then I started thinking, as I was musing about that quote from Martin Luther King Jr., I started to think about duty a little bit. And so I love this quote from Toni Morrison that says, "I tell my students, when you get these jobs that you've been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else." So this is the portion of the talk that doesn't like, I could talk about my research, but like, meh. The main things I want you to be thinking about is I don't think I would, the way that I got here is that I believe I have a responsibility to other people as well. I believe I have a responsibility to my colleagues. I believe I have a responsibility to graduate students, undergraduate students, to people who are further in their careers than I am. That communal fabric is a large part about how I view my career. And just as one example, I mentor a lot of students, but I figured I would use just one example. So I have never worked somewhere with a robust higher ed policy program. That's my area of study, but that's just never been a thing. So what I don't have, like 4 or 5 PhD students that work with me. And yet, I still mentor several PhD students across the country, which is very interesting. One day I'll ask for a check from some other institutions, but that's fine. But when I think a little bit about why might that be, I think a little bit about some stats. Again, I don't know if you thought you were getting out of this without a figure, but no way. Okay, so this is a figure. It shows you the breakdown across ranks for the racial and gender demographics of faculty in the United States in the fall of 2020. Now, this is very big, and it's actually really difficult to see Black women because there's so many white people who are faculty members. So I thought, well, maybe what I could do is put some boxes and like a big arrow to help, but it's still really challenging. So we'll actually zoom in a little bit further. So what we can see is out of all faculty in the United States, 4% are Black women. We have about 3% of lecturers who are Black women and about 5% of instructors. About 5% of assistant professors are Black women. Associate professors, we've got about 3% who are Black women. Let's take a moment for that. So in the fall of 2022, when I first got tenure, I was one of 5,291 Black women at the rank of associate professor in the United States. With around 840,000 faculty members in the United States, that means that we make up 0.6% of the faculty. That's me. Now, we know, hopefully, about all of the research about why it might be that Black women faculty are expected to do an extra load of service, particularly outside of their institutions, working with students at places that don't have faculty like me, making sure that they are cared for, that they understand the rules of the game, that they can do the best that they possibly can when it comes to the job market, their research, and that they can pass that on to others. So I just wanted to make sure, if nothing else, you've got a stat that you can take away from this talk. Oh, and of course, something to look forward to. There's 2% of full professors who are Black women. So just really strong representation there. But I also think about my responsibility to others, and I take very seriously my reviewing that I do for grants, articles, books, conferences, technical feedback that I provide to the National Center for Education Statistics, boards. I currently sit on 4 editorial boards. For those who don't know, when you sit on an editorial board, you are expected to review a set number of articles every year. So that's a guarantee of articles that I will review for each one of those journals. So that's 4, plus I'm an associate editor for the Handbook of Higher Education, and there were 2 editorial boards that I rolled off of because that seemed like too much. I share this again to say my career is more than the publications that I do. My career is about what I give back to my community and what my community gives to me. Every single article that I've published had multiple people take the time to read it and give me feedback. Some of them, like my first publication in the American Educational Research Journal, were rejected many times from many other journals, which means a large number of researchers had an opportunity to read it and give me feedback. But that means, right, that like my career is not just me. My career is about our larger field. And so I take seriously that I want to help other people the same way that other people have helped me. So for a duty-defined perspective, I say that I work to bring genuine humanity and empathy to my interactions with students and colleagues, regardless of what level or field they occupy in higher education. My hope is that every person who ever interacts with me knows that I see them as a human being first, before they are a PhD student, before they are an assistant professor, before they are a clinical track faculty member, that I see their humanity within them. Because that is the only way that I can sort of, on days when things are quite tough, those are the things that I fall back on, or the connective tissue that I have with other people. Which, of course, once I think about purpose and duty and an early career award, you have to think about legacy, right? One hopes like my legacy isn't set in stone here as an early career award, but, you know, as you think about legacy, I thought about a different legacy project that was recently released. And so from Cowboy Carter, the song 16 Carriages, which is choice, though I enjoyed the entire album. Not an objective assessment. There are 2 lines that say, for legacy, if it's the last thing I do, you'll remember me, because we got something to prove. So I turned to my dear friend, Dr. Tressa McMillan Cottom, and when she wrote about this in the New York Times, one of the things she mentioned was, on this album, she's talking about Beyonce, she makes a case for why, instead of simply embodying the latent politics of pop, house, and country, she's choosing to transform them into something else. The result is an eminently enjoyable album with some imperfections, but an indication of what could be possible if more artists follow her lead. So let's be very clear. No one leave here saying I call myself Beyonce, because that's not what's happening right now. But I appreciate the notion of embodying the work that I do, of thinking carefully about how I bring myself and how I show up within this work. I think about that a lot when it comes to, in particular, my research, because I do quantitative research on education policy. I know the ways that statistics and numbers have been used to demonize, to forcibly castrate, to kill people. I understand the ways that public policy has been used to do the same. And so I think it's incredibly important that when I show up to this work, I make sure that I'm bringing my fullest self. And if I happen to think that there are critical ways that we might be able to improve or expand the way that we do this, I want to bring that with it too. So I think a lot about how do we do quantitative research. I think a lot about how do we do policy work. That's led to research papers where I got a chance to work with really great groups of scholars, thinking carefully about how we use administrative data and how we think about the different racial groups and classification schemes within larger theorizations of racialization. We've also tried to look and see what are the patterns within racial classification within AERA journals to try to better understand how the education field does that type of work. I also work on helping to lead a speaker series that takes critical perspectives on quantitative research. And also recently, I think, oh yes, it's out. So a special issue of EPA, which focuses on education policy from a critical lens. I am one of the co-authors, a fabulous set of people, and we had a chance to really think carefully about what do we think critical education policy means? What does it look like? What could its future be? And I do all of these different things to try to ensure that the research that is done is as close to possible as what our real world experience is. Because I think when we are upfront with ourselves about things like racism and sexism, and we are appropriately thinking about that in our methods, it means that our evidence has a closer touch to our real world. It means that the evidence that we have is more likely to have a real world impact. And so I welcome the opportunity to think about the world as it really is. And I want to make sure that I make clear that when I think about legacy, I don't think about it from a standpoint of this one person creates this thing. I think about legacy from a standpoint of how you build on what was there before you, on what others have done. So as just one example, whenever I think about critical quantitative research, I always think about W.E.B. Du Bois. This is one of his visualizations where these are like astounding. By hand, they sketched out things like, so this is the valuation of town and city property owned by Georgian Negroes. And you can see across time what the property valuation is. And they actually drew in and wrote in when there were financial panics, when there was an increase in lynchings. This is centuries old. So I say that to say, by no means do I think I'm inventing anything. I'm here to keep working to build on the legacy of others. More than anything, that's sort of my hope that I would be able to do. So for me, legacy defined is working within community to imagine a better world and to find the evidence for the best pathways to improve our society. It's one of the privileges of my life. In a time when Black women academics are being attacked, threatened, and denigrated for simply being, and too frequently institutions are allowing that to occur, I do not take lightly having this award bestowed upon me. And so what I want to finish us with, it's too small, you're probably not going to be able to read it. Don't worry, I'll be reading it for you. This is an excerpt from one of my favorite poems, and it is actually the poem that I text my parents every 4th of July. And so it's from Let America Be America Again by Langston Hughes. And it says, "For I'm the one who left dark Ireland's shore and Poland's plain and England's grassy lea, and torn from black Africa's strand I came to build a homeland of the free. The free? Who said the free? Not me. Surely not me. The millions on relief today, the millions shot down when we strike, the millions who have nothing for our pay, for all the dreams we've dreamed and all the songs we've sung and all the hopes we've held and all the flags we've hung. The millions who have nothing for our pay, except the dream that's almost dead today. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose, the steel of freedom does not stain. From those who live like leeches on the people's lives, we must take back our land again, America. Oh yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. Out of the wreck and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies, we, the people, must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains and the endless plain, all the stretch of these great green states, and make America again. Thank you. No. Do I say okay? But, oh. I should warn you that my family's here, so think about that for any of your questions. Okay, great, good.
Thank you. Let's thank Professor Dominique Baker for excellent remarks. We will now engage in a Q&A session. Please use the mics because the session is being recorded. I thought there was a mic on each side, but I only see one. Oh, there are two. Oh, good. So please begin with your question.
Yeah, not to scare y'all, but the first time my mama came to a conference, she didn't know what discussants do. And afterwards, she had some words. And I had to explain to her that that was their job, to tell me ways to improve my work, and she did not agree.
Hi, Kate Kelly from the University of Denver. My question for you is like a young doctoral on the edge of her dissertation, about to go into real world. How do you find your community?
Yeah.
How do you find those people that really lift you and push you and take you, like you said in your speech?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really good question. And I think to start, I was incredibly fortunate with the folks that did my PhD program at the same time as me. So we are a very odd group, and we are odd together. And so that has been one of the most amazing. They're one of the first group of people that when I won this award, I sent a message to. But I would say that overall, I work really hard to sort of be me in as many spaces as possible. And what I mean by that is, as an example, I really love The Real Housewives. It's like a thing about me. We weren't going to make it through this without me mentioning that fact. And so, right, that's a thing that I talk about. I talk about that in work settings because you should. There's a lot you can learn sociologically from The Real Housewives. But so what I mean by that is I try to bring myself as much as I can, right? We clearly shift the way that we talk and the way that we frame in different scenarios. But I try to bring as much of myself as possible. And when that resonates with other people, then I try to nurture those relationships. So it can be the case that I might have met someone a couple of years ago, but they're really dope. And so maybe the next time I see something, they got a paper that came out, something like that, I email them. I don't expect people to, that is a genuine thing where I just want to say that's great. I saw that, just want to gas you up for a second. I love this for you. And then we can sort of move from there. There are people who I published with once and who knows if we'll ever publish again, but I still text them to see how they're doing, right? There are ways that I think we can create relationships and community with each other. And the way that I start to do that is by trying to be as genuine as I can with who I am. And yeah, because as an example, if someone thought that the people that watch reality TV are the scourge of the earth, we probably shouldn't be hanging out. I will bother you at some point about Below Deck. Oh, I know, right? Yeah, I know. It's very good television.
Other question? You can come on either side and make sure you use the mic because this is being recorded.
I have to use it anyway. I lost my voice. But I wasn't missing a moment to talk to you, girl. So I have a little bit of a nerd question. Okay. Of course I do. So with the sort of current barriers and resistance to Biden's policy changes related to student loans, which you referenced here, where do you sort of see the future of the student loan debt crisis going? And what should those of us who are not policy people be thinking about in terms of linkages between our work and the work that you're doing?
Yeah. Okay, so where do I see this going? Do we have the same Supreme Court that we... Okay. So I think it is very challenging in the current political environment to pass regulations regarding student loans that can pass political litmus tests within the Supreme Court. So because of that, I have concerns. The Biden administration, for those who don't have to have like Google alerts for this, has recently announced their new version that they are starting to roll out for how they would attempt to do debt cancellation. And with that, I think a number of us are concerned that eventually this will wind up at the Supreme Court again and then removed, said that the executive branch is overreaching its powers. And so one of the things that I'm really focused on, I think it's really important to keep in mind that the type of research that I do and the work that activists in larger communities have done, I think from a holistic perspective about the ways that they have pushed federal policy. So we talk a lot about debt cancellation. We talk less about the ways that income-driven repayment plans for student loans have had their process tweaked, or public service loan forgiveness have had their process tweaked to ensure that the original policies that were written prior to this administration are actually working the way that they were designed. That happened because of activism and research and work that pushed to say policies that we already have on the books should also be implemented better. And so I do see that that is probably a central route where a number of people will get debt canceled. I am less certain of other routes that going beyond those types of tweaks. And even within that, I would not be shocked to see lawsuits against the newest version of income-driven repayment, the SAVE plan. Okay, so that's one part. Now, people who are not policy scholars, taking my mind outside of policy, so interesting. So I would say, I think part of the reason that I say that student loans are culture is because the way that we've crafted our policy system around college affordability tells us how we value colleges and universities, whether we think that they're a public or a private good, who we think is ultimately responsible for paying for a college education, all of those pieces. And so when we think about student loan policy, I think people in other sectors, can see that as a good signal, sort of a red herring of what college is how people are talking about and thinking about and socially constructing the notion of higher education writ large. And I also think it's really difficult to find an institution where student loans, and especially college affordability broadly, isn't touching on to something for the students. Whether you are studying orgs for higher education or you're studying student development, college affordability matters for all of that. It has a fundamental role that it plays in how people process their relationship with their institutions. You know, one of the things that I love, I lurk in a lot of Reddit threads because I learn a lot about how people are processing and thinking about student loans in those spaces, a unique portion of people, but people nonetheless. And one of the things that I always think is funny is people will say something like, do you know how much money I took out to go to this college? You know how high my student loan bill is, and you calling me for a donation? That is like a number one thing that I constantly see. That says something about how people process their experience within college and how they are thinking about their relationship to the institution even after they've separated, is that they tie in their mind donations with the cost of college, with the price that they had to pay, the loans that they took out, et cetera. And so I really do think that the way that we structure student loans, talk about student loans and the impact that they have on people's lives, plays a role, a ripple effect on all segments and parts of higher education.
Hi, I'm Tito from University of Denver. I was inspired when you said you mentor so many different students across the country. So my question is, like, what advice could you give to students of color on how they can navigate mentorship or finding mentors of color, considering the statistics that you gave of representation of faculty of color in most higher ed institutions?
Yeah, and I think that's so big as well because often, I don't know about you, but like for me, I would feel bad reaching out to people, right? Because if I know that there's so few people, then they're probably mentoring people a lot, right? They've got a lot on their plate. And so what I will say is, number one, I always think it's better to reach out than not. I'm very good at telling someone that, like, right now I don't have time to do that, but please reach out to me again next year or something of that nature. So I think that that's a thing. I always err on the side of, like, it's cool to engage with people. Let someone tell you that they don't have the time. I would also say it is perfectly reasonable to sort of do a two-pronged attack, which is trying to reach out to people, senior scholars of color, while also agitating within your own programs that they should be hiring scholars of color. That's a thing they should be doing, and they should hear that from you. It's part of the reason that, like, I'm pretty particular about, like, within my own institution, where I'll say, like, oh yeah, that's a part of my job responsibility. Yes, I will do that. Oh, no, that's not at all. That's getting into something that's, like, weird, and, like, my face is on something that I don't understand that. So right, like, trying to think about where those barriers lie. So I think that's important. I would also say that one of the things I did for myself is I had to find dope white people. That's all I had at Vanderbilt. So it was that, or it wasn't going to happen. So I had to do that. And then beyond that, I tried to find ways that I could think, what is the clear ask that I'm doing for these overloaded senior scholars of color? So am I asking... is the ask, I want you to tell me what my research agenda is. Okay, that seems a little big. Are there ways that we can scope this in a bit? Is there potential that you're doing a classroom paper that you think you want to do at ASH, and it relates really strongly to something that they've done? That's a really great opportunity to say, hey, I'm really considering da-da-da-da and all this, you know what I mean? So I think scoping the ask is the nicest thing that you can do for people who have a lot of service on their plate. It's helping them to see exactly what you're asking for, sort of what the time pieces are around that, and then they can be able to figure out what makes the best sense. But I'll also say that, like, I don't know if this is positive or not, but, like, the unfortunate reality is, like, these are long-term skills that you get to cultivate. Like, this is a thing that I, like, continuously try to navigate and think about, both what is the role that I want to play for others, but also I'm still an associate. Like, I don't know, maybe I want to be a full professor. So what does that mean? Or I don't want to be a dean. Don't do that. That's my father. Sorry. He has a lot of great ideas, but not for me. So I think that those are some ways that you can try to think from a concrete perspective of how you might be able to navigate some of that.
Hello, Dr. Baker. It's good to see you.
Hi, Dr. Rorson.
When you first told me you won this award, my immediate response was amazing, but also, like, I don't think of you as early career at all because of the sheer volume of contributions you've made, really important contributions you've made to the field of higher education. And you certainly were very explicit in this talk about how you have maintained a very productive publishing schedule, but also you're contributing publicly through the media to policy conversations. I hate it when people ask questions and spend 90 minutes setting up the questions. So I'm going to get to the questions soon, I promise. But you were doing these things really even before you were an assistant professor. Mm-hmm. And I know that there is an inherent risk when you're in a tenure track role of not sort of just being tunnel vision. Mm-hmm. Let's get into these top tier journals. So I would love for you to share your perspective. What did you sort of feel sort of the risks you were taking in making these choices? How were you supported? How did you make it happen that as an assistant professor, you're able to balance all of these things and keep it moving on the tenure track line?
No, I appreciate that. That's why we had to add Chris to the dedication. Not even joking. So early, so I met my husband basically at the end of my dissertation. And in my first year on the tenure track, I said to him, and he already knew this, but I'll give you all some set, I already know the answer to this. I just need to have an actual memory of you telling me this. So I need you to tell me that even if I don't get tenure, you're not going to leave me. I need that. I know the answer already, but I need a tactile memory of you telling me this. And he's great. And so he was like, okay, no, I won't leave you because you won't, but I do, yes, no, I won't. So great. Awesome. For me, that sort of released me then. The worst thing they're going to do, they're not going to take my birthday. They're not going to take my man, right? So the worst things that they can do, look, and Nashville has a dearth of gentlemen. So that was a key concern for me. But so they weren't going to do those things, right? And so that sort of released me and gave me permission to say that, I'm going to do the career I want to do. If they don't give me tenure, they don't give me tenure. To be blunt, basically the summer as I was putting my materials together, all that kind of stuff, Nicole Hannah-Jones was denied tenure at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which was devastating for her in her own right. For me, sort of made me be well, then what's the point? From a standpoint of to be blunt, they can deny you for anything they want to. This is a political process, and they get to make whatever choices they want to make. I study things unapologetically, and so there's a very real chance that someone might deny me tenure because of that. I could let that scare me and make me choose different things to research, or I could say that, you don't want to give me tenure, you don't want to give me tenure. That does not diminish me as a person, and that most definitely does not diminish me as a scholar. And so being able to orient myself towards that, I thought was incredibly helpful, because then I had a different calculus in my mind. Sort of my North Star is always trying to think about how I am helping to think through and work with community to advance justice. And so what I didn't say right is that my North Star is to publish peer-reviewed journal articles. Peer-reviewed journal articles are one way that I work towards my larger goal, but they're not the only way. And so that's one of the reasons why I try to do the best that I can to communicate about my work, but also just the body of evidence writ large, to try to do what I can to ensure that we are doing what we can to sort of advance as a society. One of my co-authors and I did a study looking at whether the viability of lotteries for admissions. And one of the things that I tell people, I teach a class on policy communication. And one of the things I tell the students is, you will never know the amount of work I do to stop bad ideas from being published. The number of reporters from very fancy places that call me and say, I had a new idea. Know how to solve this whole thing. What if you put a lottery in that admission system? And I get to go, let's talk about that. And then after we talk about the evidence and what it would take for a lottery to be inserted into the United States, they say, I don't think I'm going to write about that. And I was like, your choice. That's one of the very important ways, because these things have power and the media can play a very outsized role in how we conceive of education generally, but education policy in particular. And so I think that it's really important that people are doing that type of work. I don't think everyone has to do that type of work, because there are risks that are inherent within there beyond just career, right? I was just talking about how you engage with the media earlier today, and one of the big things I mentioned is when I transitioned to the University of Delaware earlier this semester, I had to have conversations with them about how we protect my personal information, what happens if someone calls with threats, that I didn't want to have a phone number put on my business card, so we had to put the sort of department admin person's phone number on it. Those are all things that we have to do to try to protect the literal physical safety of me and my family. that is a risk that we take. And so that's why I do not have an issue with people that don't feel that that is a risk they can take. That is why, for me, community is so powerful. That some of us may feel that that's part of what we want to do. Some of us may feel that that's not. And that sometimes the people that are saying we're going to interface with the media, they may say that, like, right now I can't. And somebody else can take up that charge. Those are real things that I have done for others and others have done for me. And so I think the bigger thing is I'm always interested not just in what I do as an individual, but thinking about what we can do as a field, as a community of scholars.
Hello, my name is Zakia Stewart. Congratulations on your award, and thank you for your example. I had a question about bridging the gap between policies being developed and then the actual implementation. What advice would you give, or examples would you give people on how they can advocate, influence policymakers and or say departments of education?
Oh, sure.
On how to actually bridge those gaps. So I'm thinking specifically about the policies getting made and then leaving it up to the Department of Education to actually execute. But then I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. So how can we kind of get in there and influence and support to make sure that those things happen in a way that are most meaningful?
Yeah. So I love this because I actually don't think we talk as much formally about this. Part of the thing that's so interesting to me, and one of my dear friends does a lot thinking about political science and education policy. And frequently, like, we don't talk as much about political science and thinking about, like, the actual process of governance, but it's huge. And the more that I dive into it, the more I sharpen my understanding of, like, where I can contribute in those pieces. Because just from the start, if you take nothing away from this, it's the statistics about Black women faculty, and then it's the fact that most people that work in policy do not have access to an academic library. That means anytime they want to learn about any subject, I don't know, name a K-12 thing, charter schools. I'm very bad at knowing anything about K-12, but I get better every day. They can't just go to Google Scholar and type in charter schools and then click on things and say, like, I'm going to read. And I'm going to luxuriate. I'm going to spend the next 3 weeks, browsing through and learning more about this. A, they are incredibly time constrained. And B, they physically frequently cannot access that information. So because of that, I moved to a space of, what do I need to do with my work to make it as usable as possible for policy actors? And one of the things I actually did in the last year of my PhD program, AERA was in DC, and so I just decided to stay an extra week in DC, and I just took meetings all day, every day, with anybody who would meet with me, who worked for different policy orgs, policy think tanks, et cetera, et cetera. And I asked everyone, what makes research useful to you? How do you find research? What are the ways that it can be shaped to make it more easily consumable for you? What are the ways that I can help you to use my work? Because the reality is, with the power dynamics, we want them to use our work more than they want to use our work. So I got to figure out what I need to do to make my work usable for them. And so that's what led me to doing things like Off Jump. Anytime I publish a paper, I try to think, are there like 5 people that I think could benefit from reading this paper? If I think of those 5 people, I email them. And I will typically say, like, hey, you know what? I know that generally speaking, you don't, people in your positions don't have access to an academic library. So I wanted to make sure that you're aware of this work that I've done. And I will put in there something like, I don't expect you to read this. Perfectly fine. Does not bother me at all. I just want to make sure you're aware. So I try to make sure that those pieces are there. I try as much as possible to have some sort of public-facing version of every one of the papers that I write. So in the old days, I would sometimes do a Twitter thread. I now live in the blue sky world. There are like 5 people, so there are not as many people that are reading threads. But I try to do like a summary that I can post somewhere that gives a sort of simplified version, which you could think of as almost like an executive summary of the papers that I write. And they have to be publicly available in some way. So no paywalls, none of that type of thing. And that way, anyone who wants to can engage with my work in a little bit different of an language, with less jargon and all those sorts of things. I think jargon has its place. I'm actually not one of those people who's like, you can't ever have jargon. Like, no, I think we are professional, technical researchers, and jargon is just a nature. Like, standard deviation is jargon to some, right? But that's an important thing that people that do the work that I do have to know. But we can find ways to talk about our work that can remove some of those pieces that make more sense when we're talking to other academics, when we're doing more public-facing pieces like that. So I try to get my work into other people's hands, A, and then B, I really try to be as well-read as possible. And what that means is I try to read other people's work. The majority, 90, 95% of when I'm talking to people in the press and policy orgs and stuff like that, I'm not talking about my own work. I'm talking about the body of evidence. And my work may fit into that, but I'm talking from always thinking like from the forest, not just from individual trees. And so what that means is people know that they can come to me to talk to me about what equity in colleges means writ large, which is like a monstrously large topic, right? But that I can sort of talk to them about trends in the research and what that means and what that looks like. And so I really try to emphasize talking about the breadth of knowledge, which is really helpful. And quite frankly, like, not everyone is interested in engaging with policy actors, which are typically, right, like, I do not email frequently with Senator Elizabeth Warren. I do talk, I definitely talked way more with like her staffers, right, like her ed staffers when thinking about certain topics or issues. And so that in part is because I do research, but I'm also open to helping to explain to policy actors, like, what does that research mean? What does it look like? And so I think those things can be really helpful, because like those are lines that like never go on your CV. But I have like reviewed internal white papers for different types of things and given feedback on how to think about certain things. I'm being vague on purpose, but so I think that doing some of those steps that I was talking about, those concrete steps, can help to get to a place where you build relationships with people such that you can do the other work. Because all of this is relationship building. Working with the media, working with policy people, all of this is about relationships, whether or not they feel they can trust you, whether or not they feel that your intentions are good. Even reporters, they have interesting ideas about like who they trust. That was a different topic for a different day. But all throughout this is about like, how do you build a relationship as an expert in XYZ? Yeah. It's not yet. Oh.
Run across. Oh. Does it work now?
Oh, yay!
Okay. Hi, Dr. Baker. I'm Natalia Green from the University of Florida. And I was just curious, as a woman and a woman of color, how do you engage with this work and the amount of work you do while maintaining emotional wellness besides watching The Real Housewives?
Okay, but I have to be clear that watching The Real Housewives is like in the tops for that. But yes, I can go.
Same for me.
Oh, love this. We can talk about that later. This is my husband had never watched reality TV before he met me. I fixed that. Yeah, so I think that's really important, is thinking about my life holistically. And so what that means is I try to maintain boundaries between my work and my personal life. I accept that sometimes I will have to do extra work. Like that is not, I have not figured this out, so that can't happen. But I work really hard to ensure that that is not every week. So some things that we've done is we've instituted sort of, generally speaking, unless something has come up, like hard stops every day. So like at this time, like work stops. My husband and I actually go for a walk, talk about our days, those sorts of things. We make dinner together. We watch some terrible television show or film. Right, so like those are all things. I mentioned that I like to be well read, and I talked about all the fancy stuff. I also read a ton of romance books, just like a monstrous amount. And so I make time so that I can read some part of some romance book every night. So those are some of the like key ways. I am very big. So my email is not pushed to my phone. I have to actually log into my email on my phone, which creates an additional friction that makes it a little bit harder for me to get into it. So sort of at every step, I try to make it just a little bit more challenging. I don't want to give myself completely easy access to my work stuff because the reality is we do not work in an emergency field. You know, so like I have friends who are like doctors, nurses, like they work in an emergency field where like 5 seconds can determine whether or not someone lives or dies. And that is never going to happen with one of my regressions. It's just not. So by doing these types of things, it helps me to start getting in the habit of sort of separating out and saying that like this is when I work, this is when I don't work. And like I said, sometimes that a grant proposal deadline comes up, and so I just have to work. Or I recently submitted something to be a public-facing piece of communication, and they need my feedback that night. Sometimes I just have to work additionally. But those things have been really helpful, and I try to have really clear communication with people in my life. That's friends, my partner, that's my family, to be really upfront about like the things that I want to make sure that I continue to value, the ways that like basically I have people who can check me if I am starting to veer. And to be able to say, like, are you good? Like, what's going on? I've noticed, like, those types of things. I've empowered the people in my life to be able to do that as well. And so I try to make sure that that's another piece of how I can focus on this. And there's a reality that, like, I say no to a lot of things, especially as a woman of color that does quantitative research. I get asked to do the editorial boards I mentioned up there are not all of the editorial boards I've been asked to join. Those are just the ones I've said yes to. So I work to also think about what is a reasonable amount of work, what can I reasonably do within the time that I am allotted, and sometimes I am not successful in that, and so then I sit down and say, okay, this is a learning experience. What are we not doing in the future? So those are just some of the things. But no, like in all seriousness, like part of the reason I talk about the fact that I watch reality TV is because I think you can be smart and also enjoy very trashy television, but also to make clear that I am more than just like the publications. I am more than my H-index or my Google Scholar page. And I think it's important that if your thing is not reality TV and it's in my head, I was like, think of a hobby that's the opposite of reality TV. And I went to classical piano. So if your hobby is classical piano instead, like, I think it's a good thing. And I'll finish with, like, from a research perspective, scholars show that you can actually have some of your best ideas, your most creative ideas, when you allow your mind to rest. So if you're constantly pushing and on your work topics and all those sorts of things, you're not letting your brain just like cook a little bit. And so when you allow that to happen, that's when you can actually think of like some really awesome research ideas or just all sorts of things. So if nothing else gets you, it is a nice thing to do for yourself because it actually does make your work better.
Hi, this is Dinar from Syracuse University. I have two interrelated questions. First is, how do you tame down your inner critic? When the world around you is like, hey, you're a woman of color, like, they don't reach that top level, they don't reach professoriate. Like, how do you tame down your inner critic? And then related question is, how do you tame it down enough so that it doesn't come in the way of your work, reflecting on your doctoral journey and moving forward. I'm at the verge of finishing my doctorate and starting my job. So just getting that perspective would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no. And congrats on your job. Okay, so I always say, like, advice, right, is given based on a person's lived experience. And so just to be clear, since I was a baby, I knew that I could be a professor if I wanted to. That is a thing about me and my family's history with higher education. But, like, a thing nobody was ever going to tell me was that I couldn't be a professor. That didn't make no sense to me. So, but I have had at several points in my life folks who I guess were, like, astonished that I could do math, which was interesting. And so what I will say is I had a really interesting experience, like my first year of my PhD. And I'm doing all of these assignments and I'm like working to, you know, like the best of my ability and all this kind of stuff. And it reached a breaking point where, like, I was in a Ruby Tuesday over like a salad bar. The salad bar at Ruby Tuesday was very poppin' in 2016. And I like literally burst into tears and was like, and then I was worried, and I was like, oh, this is what the sneeze guard is for, right? Like, to make sure my tears don't wind up in the Ruby Tuesday salad bar. But I share that to say one of the things, I called actually my supervisor from my master's program. My master's is in very touchy-feely student affairs. And I was just like, I just don't know if this this place, like, I don't know what's going on here. And one of the things that I came to realize through that conversations with my parents and additional conversations was like, at its like base level, like, I'm dope. I am dedicated. I will work hard. I will try to learn to the best of my ability. And maybe there's something wrong with other people. And that actually, I think, one of the ways that sexism, racism, misogynoir, particularly for me, can play itself out, right, is that you tell yourself that it's you. If you just work a little bit harder, then they'll have to take you seriously. If you just get a better grade, if you just get one more publication in that outlet, they have to know then that, like, you're a smart Black woman, right? Like, that'll take care of it. And, like, no, you do all that and they'll just say that, like, I don't know, woke DEI made it so that you got that, right? Like, so there is never enough. But for me, the moment that I realized that there's never enough meant then I don't need to play that game. I don't have to try and prove my worth to those people because it will never be enough for them. And when I let myself remove them from my audience of interest, it allowed me the opportunity to flourish, so that I could say that, like, no question. It was very funny. So there were some faculty members at my PhD program who I would say, like, at the start of my career were like a little bit like, I don't know about that one, right? And like by the time I finished my PhD, we're like, do you want to take that job at SMU? Because, like, I think if you did this one little postdoc, you could be at named very fancy school, right? And, like, in their mind, part of that was because that was what was in their mind, like, a great idea. But what it meant was, right, like, I had somehow accidentally proven my worth to some people who I was never interested in proving my worth to. So to me, right, I focus on the people I care about, people who seem to be genuinely invested in me. And the way I sort of free myself is, for certain people, nothing that I do will ever be enough. And so I don't waste my time trying for them. And then again, it was fine if I didn't get tenure, right? Because, like, nobody was breaking up my marriage, so we're good. So that means that then, okay, if I don't have tenure, I'm going to go get a different job. And that's okay, because for myself, I knew that, like, if I didn't get tenure, that's something on them. That's not something that's on me. So I think it's that shift. Like, this is not about, like, my deficits at all. These are about larger structural deficits in our world. And yes, I have to be in this world, but that doesn't mean I have to make those parts be the focus of my life. You're very special. We're doing one more?
Hi, Dr. Baker. My name's Hannah. I'm a graduate student at Stanford University. And I have a question about any advice you have for students as they're navigating this new post-SFFA world. You talked a lot about policies at the national level, but what policies would you encourage graduate and undergraduate students to push for at the level of the university?
Yeah. Post-FFA. So I think I'm a really big believer in context-specific policies, is what I'll say. I don't believe that one size sort of fits all. What works at Stanford does not make sense at the University of Virginia, does not make sense at Howard, does not make sense at Langston University. And so I want to just start from that space. I think that a lot of institutions would benefit from thinking really carefully about what their mission is, what their goal is, and then thinking about the types of policies that can be suited to that work, whether that is something where you consider whether or not you require tests. That is a choice that institutions get to make based on their grounded context, whether or not institutions are thinking about sort of state-level policy, because institutions do most definitely have the ability to encourage their states to make some additional decisions with things like direct admissions policies in certain states that we're seeing happen, where students are able to sort of automatically be admitted. So I have a really unsatisfying answer for you, which is I really think it is like heavily context dependent, because, you know, just as a small example, there are things that, so one of the institutions I just mentioned, Langston University, that's a public HBCU in Oklahoma. And Oklahoma has laws in place such that it actually makes it really difficult for an HBCU to talk about things like racial justice, which is very odd, like, oh, why are we here? We just randomly popped up, no reasons. And so I think the policies that can work at Howard even functionally can't in Oklahoma. So those are some pieces that I think, but I'll also just sort of end this with the piece that, like, for everyone, I think it's really useful to think carefully and critically about, like, at what points do institutions need to, or groups within institutions need to sort of withhold their labor. And so I think even within right-to-work states, there are ways that students, faculty, staff can think really carefully and critically about at what points, for example, UT Austin firing 60 people who no longer work on DEI projects yet are being sacrificed to satisfy the state legislature. That we can have questions about at what point do we withhold our labor from the institution.
Any other questions? Well, if not, let's thank Dr. Baker warmly